Hello and welcome to the Malika Writes channel. My name is Malika Writes, and today I will be answering some questions. So, the first question is: how do you view the balance of power in the modern marriage relative to history? And how is this navigable for modern couples, in your opinion? Okay, so historically, marriages between aristocracy, at the very least, have been more about power, transference of land and wealth, and connections. And oftentimes, we view all marriages like that, which I think is nonsensical, because that would be like someone in the future looking at the Kardashians and thinking, oh, this is how everyone lived, which clearly it's not. So, when we're looking at marriages in the past, looking at the rich and the ones who could afford to have their lives and marriages recorded is just giving us one perspective, and that is the perspective of people who had access to land and who had access to property and animals and things like that. Most people were serfs or peasants, so they didn't own anything, and their marriages were more or less were more or less love marriages, to be honest. This idea that love marriages just kind of came about in the last 100 years is yeah, it's that, because we have stories, for example, of people marrying for love, even aristocracy eloping together. The whole Tristan story and his love interest, whose name I can never say, but that's a whole story about two members of the aristocracy eloping together and wanting to be together. So love and marriage are not these two like separate concepts that have never intertwined. Yes, within people, amongst people who had things to lose, it was more about property and stuff like that. But when you have nothing, you're pretty much given a little bit more leeway to marry someone that you might like. Sure, everybody wants their daughter or son to marry, a family that maybe has that's maybe higher on the peasant ranking, but for the most part, people who were of the peasantry class or the serf class would have married the person they liked or wanted to marry, or their parents liked, or who their parents would agree to, but it wasn't devoid of love the way we sort of think about it. So, in that sense, if you want to look at a historical marriage, it would have been a lot more survival based. So even if you do like the person, obviously attraction isn't new. People would have been attracted to the one who they thought could ensure their survival the most. And where you have such a tight restriction on a particular class, bonds between different families would have been a lot stronger. So you would have had things like communal childcare. So instead of having the wife at home all the time, because she is also a peasant and you don't really have much property to be looking after anyway in your straw house, she would be out in the fields as well. So what you have is more of a communal caretaking, where the women would all be sort of working together. The older children would be looking after the younger children. And so what you have is that the house duties and sort of responsibilities of the wife in the house more often than not get passed on to the firstborn daughter. And the son is usually working already in the fields. So it's a lot less clean cut than we sometimes generalize, just to have a simpler conversation, because these are very nuanced things to talk about. But just to make things simple, we often generalize and be like, oh no, the wife is in the house. And that wasn't really the case, because if you're a member of the peasantry class, you're not really working in the house. There's not much of a house for you to work in. So we have to remember that our standard of living, our way of living, is not the only way, and it's not even necessarily the best way. If we had to look at history, we all sort of bemoan the loss of community in the modern age in some parts of the world. So the way that we live today it's a different sort of dynamic, but it's not always too dissimilar to how we've lived in the past if you go to different places around the world. So if we look at the historic marriage, I don't really think that it has a lot to tell us about what marriage should be like today. Reason being is because unless you're picking a very specific type of marriage, which is an aristocratic marriage, or a very specific time period, just referencing a casual sort of historic period doesn't really work, because there have been so many different ways that marriage has been used or manifested throughout history. So you'd have to be very specific. So just for the case of this question, I'm going to look at an aristocratic marriage, and see how maybe this could tell us something about dynamics of a modern marriage. For starters, most aristocratic marriages would not have been for love. So I don't really know whether that's the kind of setup you would like today, but most of them would have been for property. The man would have been what is seen to be a traditional head of the household. His noble wife would have not had to do physical labor. She probably would have spent her days embroidering, or running the household affairs. So she may have had some sort of knowledge of money and finance, especially if she were the lady of a particular keep. Then she would have had to have knowledge of how to maintain the keep, finances, things like that, because while her husband is away, the king could call him at any time and he would have to ride off. The tower would still need to work and keep going while he was away. So she would have to have knowledge of finances and such things. She would have to have a very good understanding about how the peasants worked, because that would be her main job, to organize the peasants and to make sure that they were farming the land properly, that things came in well, that the grain was all collected, things were distributed as she and her husband wanted, mostly her husband, or if they were compatible, then both of them. But that's the sort of dynamic. Remember, even for the noble class, there was no plumbing, so life was harder than it is now. And plumbing is just one of the many pleasures that we take for granted until it gets blocked, and then we understand what it's like to live in an age that is not the modern one. So what does this kind of tell us about marriage? It just tells us that basically marriages conform to their times and conform to how they are, how the needs that people during that particular time have. So I don't think it is necessarily a good thing to look at history for advice on how marriages should work, just because unless you're being very specific, then you're not really going to get a good example, because in different they had different things in different places. Like polygamy was really big in the east and in the south of the world, and here in some places, if you died, your wife got sacrificed with you. So you have to be very specific in looking at marriages. It's not just one linear story. That's the way history is taught in schools, because it's very difficult to teach history as the way it happened in a school environment where 20 minutes of a 40-minute lesson, you're trying to get kids to settle down. So I don't think it's useful to look at history and sort of say, okay, how does a marriage work, or how should a marriage work, because there's so many different sort of dynamics. What is more useful is to look at how different ideologies prescribe marriage. So say, for example, if you are going for let's say the Christian ethos or the Islamic ethos, which says if you can provide for four wives, then you can very well go ahead and have four wives, which is the Islamic ethos. So if you are looking at that, then it's a lot easier for you to say, okay, how does this ethos prescribe how a marriage should run? If you're looking at the Christian ethos, there are very clear lines on how marriage should run. And that has predominantly been the sentiment in the West, but with varying degrees of success. For example, people could be married and still have mistresses. That I'm talking aristocracy, or very high members of the peasant class. But normal people didn't really have access to that. So or they could still cheat though. So at the end of the day, it's more useful to look at a particular ideology and see how they talk about marriage and what they describe a marriage is what a marriage is supposed to be like, rather than saying, okay, let's look at history and see how it was done, because it's very broad. It's very difficult to look at one period of history and say, okay, this was the ideal stage for marriage, because they had very different living requirements, which conformed their view on how marriage should be, and that's how they sort of practiced it. So it's a lot better to look at ideologies rather than it is to look at, okay, how was it historically done. As for the balance of power in marriages, again, that's something that I would suggest looking at a particular ideology, because historically that has changed. And from person to person, that has also changed. There's a very interesting medieval writer called Marjorie Kemp, and the balance of power in her relationship was not what we typically think. And also, when people think of the Middle Ages, they don't think of penis trees, for example. There's this lovely little illustration in the side of a hymn book, which is basically a monk harvesting penises from a penis tree. It's hilarious. But we don't think of the little nuances. We often seem to sort of think of the past as this place where, oh, this was the particular order and there was no... We forget that there was nuance. We forget that human beings are more or less the same today as they were back in the past. So it's people have very different dynamics between them. For example, Marjorie Kemp, there was this really hilarious bit in her stories where she's sort of telling her husband, I have been convicted of having to be married to you, so we will no longer have sex because I want to be pure within the marriage. According to Christian doctrine, it's not impure to have sex within a marriage, but she is making this claim and saying, God told me. But it's a very hilarious thing because her husband sort of goes with it because he has a calmer sort of temperament than Marjorie does. She's a very fiery woman. And I think she'd be someone to definitely read. She was hilarious. But again, that's an individual thing. For the most part, yes, as the stronger counterpart, men have had the dominance in a culture that required them to do more physical labor. Because that was a time where you would have to do more physical labor. However, in our modern age, if we have to relate all of that back to our modern age, physical labor isn't necessarily what we see at the forefront of the economy. You have a lot of office jobs. You have, of course, we still have things that demand physical labor, which are very male dominated. I would say that their cultural importance or significance in the eyes of the layman sort of has been diminished. So they're not seen as necessary or as desirable to the modern woman. That it's not necessarily a desirable job to the modern woman at this point in time. Whereas before, if you could, work the fields very well, you would have been a very great catch. But that's just people moving on. That's just time moving on. You can't expect it to sort of stay the way it was in the 1700s. So when it comes to power balances, again, I really do believe this. It's better to look at what particular ethos you subscribe to and just find someone who also subscribes to that ethos, rather than to look at a particular period of history, because when you study history, there's so many different nuances. Nothing is as clean cut as the blanket statements we use, and I completely understand the need for blanket statements because, my God, do they make it so much easier to talk about things. But when you're actually looking for things like, okay, how are we supposed to look at marriages? If you look at an aristocratic, I can't say that word ever the first time, an aristocratic marriage, on how to sort of navigate a modern marriage, it wouldn't work because most modern people don't have the resources that nobility had back in that day. You don't have the appeal of being a noble, which definitely helped people look past a lot of inbred problems and and other deficiencies. So yeah, I personally think ideology over looking at history to sort of set the example. This doesn't obviously apply for everything, but it's for something like marriage, definitely. So the next question, um, it was particularly helpful how you emphasized that the Proverbs woman is bold and empowered, given all the stereotypes we have about religious teachings being the root of oppression to women. So, would it be fair to say the fair rebellion instinct can be channeled into scriptural ideas of womanhood, being bold and empowered and knowing her own mind and making her own choices, etc., rather than necessarily being a revolt against it? I completely agree, because I do not think that the two are separate from each other. Um, in the Christian doctrine, we believe in a God that made a tangible world. So all the things within it are a cause of, not buildings, of course, because humans built that, but all of the sort of concepts, the blueprint of the world is something that he laid down. And so the Fey instinct is not a revolt against him. It's not something that can lead you. It's not something that you can justifiably say leads you astray, because freedom and the desire for freedom is a very human instinct. Um, and that's part of our blueprint. So the Fae, when the Fae sort of rebellion, when it's in proportion to everything else, doesn't actually work to the detriment of the person. It's when things have happened, say an abuse has been done against that person, that this Fae element gets out of proportion and then becomes a sort of self-destructive energy that we see. But when everything is sort of within, give or take, within its proper proportions, it's actually a driving force. It's actually something that gives people that sense of adventure, and it doesn't go against scriptural teachings. You're not supposed to be this stuffy, doesn't like to do anything fun Puritan. You're not Oliver Cromwell. So I really do agree with the sentiment that um, this Fey rebellion stage is very much part of human beings. It's an important part of our development, and I think that it's something that goes hand in hand with exploration. Now, you, as the person, decide what exactly you want to explore, and you get to make the choice of whether you think it's detrimental to you. So, again, coming to that thing of free will, I think that we have our impulses, but we are not weaker than our impulses. Like, we can have an impulse for violence or for aggression in a particular situation. We ultimately make a choice about whether to exercise those things. When it comes to that Fey rebellion instinct, it's there, it's useful, it's practical. Whether you decide to then use it to do something that will be detrimental to you is ultimately your choice. So that's kind of my opinion on it. I think that if you look at the creatures and the people in Narnia, for example, C.S. Lewis wrote extensively about what being a Christian is supposed to feel like. And if you look at the Narnians, they are very much free, joyful people. That's the Fey energy, but it's within proportion. It's not causing them to do things that are hedonistic and just detrimental to the self, but it's causing them to express joy. They're free, they dance through the streets, they are people who are happy. They found a truth, they found a freedom, and they're allowed to express it. Christianity ultimately is about letting you express all that you were meant to be, but in a way that isn't detrimental to you, in a way that has taken into account foresight. So you're not doing things that may feel good today, but next week are not going to look great. Like eating a burger that feels great when you're eating it, but then that waistline a few weeks later. So that's basically Christianity. It's eating that kale salad, and you can add spice to it. You don't have to eat it bland. You can season it a little bit. You can have fun. You can have mango on the side. You can open yourself up to an array of lovely, healthy things without without actually doing something that harms you in the long run. So I do one of the things I definitely agree with, that is a principle from the Bible, is that discipline is ultimately freedom. So that's basically what the Bible teaches. Love thy neighbor and be disciplined and obey God's law, which is just teaching you discipline. So I do think it's a very much entwined with the Christian doctrine. It doesn't lead you astray. If someone is led astray by their fey, rebellious side, then that's a personal choice. It's not something that you can say, oh well, you know, they're going through a phase. It's more nuanced than that. So thank you so much. The last question for today is, what character are you like? Not necessarily what character is your favorite character, but what character do you think is most like you? The character who I think is probably most like me would have to be Buffy from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. She's not my favorite character. And when you watch the Buffy series back, some of the action scenes are just lovable. they're just cringy in a lovely sort of way. It's like when I recently rewatched, I say recently, this was like almost a year ago, rewatched the Xena Warrior Princess series, which I really loved growing up. I noticed some of the questionable choices. Lucy Lawless looked a lot more muscular to me back in the day. But now, you know, I just noticed some things that I just flew over my head as a child. There were some things that was like, okay, that's questionable. But it's still a lovely show, by the way. So I think if I had to say a character that is probably like me in personality, in the way that I go about the world, and sort of how I function normally, and so also internally how I feel when I'm not around people or just kind of by myself, I would have to say Buffy. Yeah, that's if you know what she's like, then yeah, you've kind of gotten a good idea of what I'm like as well. So that's the last question. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely day. Keep sending in your questions. I know I haven't answered everything here, but some of these questions need sort of longer form answer, which I want to give them. So thank you so much for watching. This has been the Malika Writes channel. I hope you have a lovely day.